Michael Ableman is a farmer. I think it's fair to introduce him first as a farmer, and it will be great to end up the day hearing from a farmer. Michael is famous for starting an urban agriculture project in Central California. He lives in Vancouver, British Columbia now with his family, but he practices as a writer, a photographer, and a speaker, and we have the privilege of hearing from him. After Michael's talk, come on up. After he speaks, he will be available in the lobby outside to sign his books if anyone would like to get his autograph. So, Michael.
Thank you very much. You guys are amazing. It's been a long day. And I don't know how long you're going to want to sit here, so maybe I have been abbreviating, and I will continue to slash my talk here as we go. You know, I had a wonderful and very awkward experience. People are so kind around here. I arrived at my hotel room, and there was a huge hunk of locally produced cheese waiting for me in my room that someone had sent there for me. And I'm not sure, I must have been really tired from the trip because I just instinctively stuck it in my suitcase and zipped it all up with my clothing inside. And I'm not sure, I noticed people have been giving me a lot of space since I've been walking around. But it was a nice gesture, very nice. By the way, I should mention someone commented on goat meat. There is a huge demand for goat meat right now in North America, especially in Canada and the U.S. And I would, in fact, encourage anyone who's considering that as an enterprise to do so, because there is an enormous unfulfilled demand, primarily amongst ethnic communities who have moved to this part of the world from other places. So it is an important thing to get into. In the early 70s, and this will be a little bit of a departure, I'm going to tell you a few stories, and if you're well behaved, I'll show you some slides at the end, which I think will make for a good closing here. In the early 70s, I joined a commune that was based on agrarian principles. We had 3 different parcels of land totaling some 4,000 acres, on which we raised row crops, orchards, operated a complete goat and cow dairy, and produced grain and fiber. We supplied our own natural food stores and bakery and juice factory and restaurant, as well as feeding ourselves. We even made our own clothing, our own backpacks, and our own shoes. Actually, it took me a long time to admit my commune days, but now I'm proud of it. Now, after only 4 months living in that community, I was given the responsibility of managing the 100-acre pear and apple orchard located in a high desert valley east of Ojai, California. And at the time, this was one of just a handful of commercial orchards in the country that was being farmed organically. So here I was at the age of 18 with no orcharding experience, having never managed anything, directing a crew of 30 people, most of whom were older than I. The orchard had been abandoned for 15 years. The branches between the trees had become so intertwined that you couldn't find the alleys down the middles of the trees. I had a 1930s copy of Modern Fruit Science, the journal from the guy who ran the place before and gave up in frustration, and a copy of Goethe's famous quote, "Whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Attached to the door of my 20-foot unheated trailer." Now, I should tell you that under most similar situations, I would have probably spent the rest of my life working in some high-rise office building. But there was something that took place down those rows of apple and pear trees, something very different than what is happening now in most agricultural fields and orchards in North America. You see, I went to work each day with 30 of my friends. And while we worked, we joked and we talked and we discussed our dreams. We tried out our latest theories on each other and philosophies and speculated on the fate of the earth and ate our lunch together under the shade of those trees. In the winter, we pruned every day for 4 months straight. In the spring, we thinned fruit. And in the fall, it was a 10-week harvest marathon. Now, it was repetitive work. But at the end of each day, instead of feeling I had been chained to some mind-numbing drudgery, I felt like I had attended an all-day party. The work got done, the orchard thrived, and those apples and pears gained a reputation around the country. And while the cold nights and hot days of that high desert provided ideal growing conditions, I'm sure that that fruit was equally infused with the energy of that group of people and the pleasure they found in each other and in that land. Now, this was my introduction to agriculture. This community experience has informed all of my agricultural endeavors since. And it demonstrated something very important, that good food is more than just the confluence of technique and fertile soil, that it is the result of men and women who love their land and who bring great passion to working with it. Now, I farmed, as was mentioned, a 12.5-acre farm in Southern California. I just have to show you 2 slides if I can actually get them to work here. Let's see if this works. I have to show you these 2 slides because they are so emblematic of what has happened not only all around North America, but in many parts of the world. This was the little farm that I was on for 25 years in California in 1954, all surrounded by agriculture, in a valley that boasted some of the deepest and richest topsoil anywhere on the West Coast, some 30 feet of topsoil, okay? Anyway, you have to use your imagination because in 1998, the same viewpoint, it looks like a computer chip. Every piece of open land has been fully developed. We'll go ahead and turn this off here. And I have to, there is some consolation by reminding myself that by paving over our precious topsoils, we have preserved them for future generations. But I have to tell you, on that 12.5 acres, we produced 100 different fruits and vegetables, employed 30 people, fed 500 families, and grossed close to $1 million in income annually. I only tell you those numbers not to impress you, but to diminish the illusion and the idea that we cannot make small agricultural enterprises economically viable. But what's important about that place is that along with nourishing the local community with the fresh products, we nourished them through less tangible ways through a number of programs that we ran. And that land has, during our tenure, was preserved in perpetuity under one of the first agricultural conservation easements in the country, which not only protects it as agriculture, but specifies what type of agriculture must take place there and requires that education take place on that land in perpetuity, a document attached to the title which, in a sense, gives the land a voice. We've talked a lot about giving people and cultures a voice, but I think it's also important to find ways to give the land a voice into the future. Now, I want to get that off of there. That's better, yeah. Now, I now live on Salt Spring Island off the coast of British Columbia, on an island that has some 10,000 people and 10,000 different opinions about everything. In fact, we refer to Salt Spring Island as an argument surrounded by water. We farm on one of the original homesteads, a 120-acre place. If we could have the lights up, it's awfully dark in here. A 120-acre place with the original log house and outbuildings, a farm that sits in the heart of the island's watershed, with forests and creeks, a pristine lake, fields and pastures, a beautiful blend of farm and ecosystem surrounded by large protected parcels. Could not be as different from where I came from as you could possibly get. Now, historically, it has been called the foxglove farm for the wonderful flowers that are so prevalent in that region. And as you may know, foxglove or digitalis is used in medicine to restore human heart function. And we inherited that farm name, and we intend to keep it, as it is places like that that are helping to restore the heart function of the world. And we've created the Center for Art, Ecology, and Agriculture, which starting this summer will bring artists and writers and musicians, foresters, farmers, and watershed experts to share their knowledge within the context of a working landscape. And we're into our third season farming on that land, along with developing the infrastructure and restoring some of the old buildings. Now, converting 50-year-old pastures into food production makes you look like you know what you're doing, all that built-up fertility. But the real skill comes in maintaining that over the long haul. But that land has some unique advantages. Our farm fields are surrounded and intersected by swaths of intact forests. And my sense is that those fields and forests are wired together, connected in ways that I am just beginning to understand. And when the fall rains started, the entire place became transformed into this magic world where chanterelle and shaggy parasol and hedgehog and cauliflower and fairy ring mushrooms popped up everywhere. And I imagine this vast network of mycelium, miles of tiny threads moving from forest to field, providing the underpinning for soil and plant health. The first season on that farm produced spinach with leaves the size of dinner plates, raspberries and asparagus planted in June that looked like 3-year-old plants by September. Potatoes and tomatoes and French melons and strawberries showed no humility or self-control, producing an obscene volume and size. And I felt like the ringmaster of some sort of fruit and vegetable circus where all the performers have gone off on their own tangents. At the local farmers market, I was actually accused of operating some sort of secret genetics lab up at our place. But the most wonderful part of these early years on that land are the quiet glimpses into the past that appear in unexpected ways. The sense that we are a part of a long chain of humans on that land, from the native people who fished its creeks and lake, to those who built the original homestead, to ourselves, each link has been informed by the past and by the land itself. And I believe that land chooses and dreams us as much as we choose it. Everywhere I work, rebuilding a fence, restoring an old building, preparing a field, I realize I'm placing another layer on the multiple layers of those who came before me, imposing my dream on someone else's from some time in the past. Now, I've always talked about the importance of land tenure as a critical principle for creating a truly sustainable agriculture. But now I wonder what land tenure really means. After all, we are all just really passing through, temporary tenants and caretakers of a larger natural force. And all that will ultimately remain is the land, and the best that we can do is to leave it more fertile, more alive, more biologically diverse than we found it, and to use our brief time on the land to feed and to nourish and to inspire. Now, I'm not sure why, but I've had this reoccurring relationship with islands, both literally and metaphorically, since I was a young man. Now, my attraction has not been the cliched tropical fantasy allure of palm trees and white sand and turquoise waters. It's something else, something much deeper. Island as metaphor for our experience on Earth, representing independence and interdependence, natural limits and boundless space, island as paradox. And living on an island, which I now do, I have discovered that you can't get away with anything. Every human interaction, every unnecessary material consumption, every bit of waste, every morsel of food has clear links, impacts, and reactions. The feedback loop on my small island is pretty immediate. There is no vast landmass where the ripples of one's actions and interactions can radiate over long distances and large populations in a great anonymous dilution. And if we consider the Earth itself as an island floating in a sea of space, in fact, our only ship at sea, as my friend and mentor David Brower used to describe it, we might consider or reconsider how we take care of it. Now, when I was 16 years old, I visited the island of Jamaica to help my brother develop a small piece of land he owned outside of Negril. And we were taken in by Gretel Hilton and her partner, Uncle Will, who patiently instructed us in some basic survival. How to sharpen a machete, open a coconut, what herbs to use if we were injured or sick, how to cook breadfruit, and how to fish from the cliffs along the sea. They must have felt responsible for us, two young white boys not particularly well adapted to Jamaican bush life. And at the time, I'm sure I viewed their world and the knowledge they had of that place as necessary but somewhat quaint, maybe even a little backwards, a far cry from where the world was going. I had no idea at that time that I would eventually devote my life to learning those very skills, writing and teaching about the critical importance of rediscovering our place in nature and how to grow food. My generation at the time was in the early stages of what is now a total worship of technology. We were invested in our own human cleverness, believing it was far greater than nature's wisdom. We didn't realize the ecological and social price we would all pay for this arrogance. Gretel Hilton and Uncle Will were still immersed in the natural history of a place we call Jamaica, and they were not alone. And at that time, most rural families were fairly self-sufficient, still had chickens and goats, a breadfruit tree, coconut trees, mango, a little cultivated yam and greens. And if they lived near the coast or a river, they fished. Now, I returned to Jamaica a few years ago, after 35 years, to work on an agricultural and community development project. And much has changed, as it has everywhere. And most profound is that natural self-sufficiency that was so much of my experience back then is now the exception rather than the norm. The potential for abundance is still there, supported by a tropical climate, rich soils, and plentiful water. But that self-reliance, especially in regards to food, has been replaced by a total dependency on imports from abroad. Taste and smell have an uncanny ability to form the basis for memory. And prior to my return to Jamaica, I looked forward to the taste of a nation that had so acutely lodged in my subconscious the intense, rich flavors of real banana and pineapple, oranges so ugly but so incredibly rich in flavor, and mango like dirt man. And while poverty in the economic sense of the word was endemic then as it is now, this diversity and food quality was a form of national wealth embodied by rural communities that prided themselves on the variety and quality of their fruits and the knowledge and an intimacy with a place. And sadly, on my return, I did not rediscover the tastes of those foods. So much of the fruit I find there now is not that different from the tasteless exported tropical products you find sitting on a shelf here in Boston or in Toronto or Los Angeles. And I would encourage you, by the way, to watch a wonderful film that was made by Stephanie Black about Jamaica, which tells the bigger story, called Life or Debt. It's very powerful, and it's very emblematic of what we're seeing in this very familiar story from all over the world. And I like to speak about islands because islands are places that immediately manifest cause and effect. I think they're very important to look at. Now, I now have two sons. One is 27 and one is 7. It's my version of long-term crop rotation. And while I remain hopeful that at least one of them will eventually take over the farm, I suspect that after watching how hard we work, they may want something else. You know, I always thought that if you wanted your kids to farm, then don't raise them on one. But the question of succession has become very real and very personal for me lately as I get older. I've always said that the best way to encourage young people to get involved with our profession is to demonstrate that you can make a decent living doing it. Pretty practical stuff. And I still believe that, and a large part of my work has been in creating and in putting forth some of the successful models. But my ideas as to how to communicate this are changing. And I think this is an important place here. This is really, I think, to a great degree, what all this comes down to that we've been discussing today is how we communicate, okay? And how we communicate our stories. You see, I used to think that if I could just tell folks why it was important to consider another way, if I could be more eloquent in my expression, if I could just convince them, beat them into submission, that things would change. And now I think, if I could just grow the best tomato. You see, I've realized that pleasure is a much greater motivator for change than guilt. Think about it. I need some water. I'm not worried about swine flu, by the way. I'm sure that someone has been drinking out of this, but really now. So think about how successful has the last 30 years of the environmental movement really been. Now, there's been some really good work done by many of my friends and colleagues, battles won, pristine places preserved, a greater awareness of the awesome threats to our biosphere instilled in the minds of many. But most of the messaging, as Satish was saying, has been all doom and gloom, and while folks have come to understand the problems, they too often feel helpless when it comes to the solutions, paralyzed in the face of the enormity of our modern dilemma. And clearly all the well-planned environmental campaigns, all the creative strategies, all the books and organizations have only succeeded in preserving and protecting and restoring a few bits and pieces and specks. Isolated victories, all while the world's natural systems unravel at a staggering rate. So the question is, and here's the question for all of you, how do we provide an invitation rather than a harangue? I finally got it. I got it. I got it standing on my farm last spring. I was out there with the deafening sound of thousands of frogs fornicating in my ponds, earthworms doing it beneath my feet, mason and bumble and honeybees fighting to stuff themselves into every flower in sight. And I suddenly realized, I'm not farming. I'm presiding over one big giant orgy. I realized that every form of life on my farm is absolutely immersed in this incredible humming, buzzing, and vibrating vortex of lust. So all this time I've had it wrong. I've been trying to entice young people back into agriculture with all the wrong messages, when all they really need to know is that there's all this sex happening on farms. I actually have about a 10-minute rap on that, which I will spare you, but how are we doing here? Are you holding up okay, or do you want me to cut it short? Yeah? Okay? Okay. I'm going to go for it here. Well, in 1994, I was running that farm that you saw in California, and the Northridge earthquake hit. Well, I lived on that farm for 25 years in a house that was built in 1895, a house, interestingly enough, that was built without any studs. It's all single-wall construction. You can only get away with that in California, where no insulation was required. And interestingly enough, it survived many historical earthquakes. But you have to understand, in a house that old, when the cat jumped on the roof, it would sway back and forth like a ship at sea, right? So when, at 4 in the morning, when that earthquake hit in Northridge, which was about an hour plus south of us, that house just swayed back and forth and literally threw me out of bed. And the first thing I did was to race in and grab my eldest son, the younger one was not born yet, and head out the back door of the house just in time to see all of the electricity in Southern California go off in a wave. It was quite beautiful because there's so much light pollution there that it's a rare moment that you get to see the night sky. The next morning, the sun came up, and it was one of those brilliantly still days that often occurs after an earthquake. And I thought, I had better go out and see if the world around us still existed. I thought, what better way to do that than to walk down to the local supermarket, which, by the way, I can't keep track of the names because they changed every 2 years, but I think at the time it was Vaughn's, On the way to the supermarket and the 2 or 3 blocks walking, traffic was colliding at mid-intersection. The traffic lights were down. The cars were lined up at the gas stations. The pumps were not functioning. And when I reached the door of that supermarket on that brilliant, clear, sunny day and crossed the threshold, it was pitch black inside, and people were frantically navigating the aisles using flashlights. The meats were going off on the shelves, the dairy products were melting, and when they reached the checkout counters, there were huge cardboard signs that said, "Sorry, no change." The ATM machines were down. And I think at that moment, more than any other moment, I had the intellectual information, but that moment really provided me with the sense of how incredibly fragile and how incredibly precarious our food system really is. All that had happened in that neighborhood was the power had gone off. We weren't even in the earthquake center. Now, my former neighbors who shop in that supermarket are well-paid, highly educated individuals, many who work in high-tech defense research companies. Yet if that store had stayed closed, they would have been hard-pressed to feed themselves. With all of their education, with all of their financial resources, with all of their knowledge about the most sophisticated technologies, they were powerless when faced with taking care of the most basic of human needs. In contrast, I think of the urban farms and gardens I've visited all around the world, neighborhoods in North America where household incomes are $5,000 and less per year, neighborhoods that have some of the highest infant mortality and violent crime rates. And yet, in those most vulnerable of places, food is being produced and consumed and sold. And I remember one woman, actually in Philadelphia, who told me while standing in her house with broken windows that we always grow a little extra to feed the poor. So I'd like to challenge the common perception that farms, by definition, need be separate from cities and that food must flow into the city from somewhere else. This assumption implies that urban dwellers are helpless creatures, just waiting like baby birds in the nest to be fed from distant farms, and that the urban environment cannot create and sustain its own internal food systems. In fact, most folks believe the responsibility of feeding the world belongs wholly to farmers. But a significant percentage of the world's poor are surviving not from the products of their nation's farms, but from their own small urban plots. You see, when the food system no longer fulfills the needs of the people, whether for economic or distribution reasons, or because of concerns for food safety, or simply because people want corn that tastes like corn, or potatoes that are more than just a tasteless medium to convey ketchup and salt to their mouths, then they take that responsibility into their own hands. So while many look to a new agriculture, organic or otherwise, as the source of our salvation, and I wish I had more time to talk about that, there is another revolution taking place in neighborhoods, in backyards, and in cities. And I believe that urban agriculture will become an essential element in our ability to feed the future. And in 1987, when I founded the Center for Urban Agriculture, many folks were puzzled by putting those two words together. It sounded like a contradiction of terms. After all, weren't farms far from cities? And we now have some excellent models of urban agriculture, the best of which have evolved not because it's the right thing to do, but out of raw necessity. Cuba has one of the most sophisticated urban agricultural systems in the world. There is an estimated 200,000 people employed in urban agriculture there, providing close to 40% of the food consumed in Cuba's cities. Havana has an urban agriculture department supporting a complex network of urban farms, providing meat, eggs, milk, fruits, and vegetables to the city. But that system in Cuba came forth out of a crisis of significant proportions. An entire nation was facing starvation. But we, too, are facing a food crisis, one that has been brewing for some time, one that's been talked about for most of the day. But the difference is that the impacts of our crisis, at least in this part of the world, have yet to become personal enough to force the kind of structural changes that need to happen. As energy prices continue to climb, as farmland everywhere is converted from food to fuel production, as climate change continues to play out, the cost and the quality and the secure access of food will, I believe, become the central and the dominant issue of our time. But those who are already living at poverty levels and those who do not have access to land or the skills to grow food are the most at risk. Most cities are wholly and completely dependent on the importation of their basic foodstuffs from afar, creating an incredibly precarious and vulnerable situation. And as of the new millennium, as you probably know, the majority of the world's population are not rural. They are urban, and that is a pretty dramatic historic shift. And I do not believe it will be possible to continue to feed those cities entirely and solely from distant farms. The Cubans created that world-class model that I described because they had to. We need to rethink how we feed our cities now and how we will feed the future before our choices are narrowed for us. Now, I have a whole range of initiatives that I was going to offer, but some of which are quite wonderful, but I'm going to skip ahead because I think that it's getting late. There is a couple things that I'm going to include here. One of which is, I think, very critical to our conversation. You know, when I was in school, my favorite classes were woodshop and metal shop, and even home economics, much to the concern of my classmates that I would actually be studying sewing and cooking. But I thought it was very practical. And I look forward to shop class. I remember every woodshop teacher was missing a few digits, you know. And I'm sure that was a requirement on the application when they applied for those jobs, because I made a very quick connection between those missing fingers and those machines, which to this day, I respect those machines, you know. But those classes were very important to me. They were, in fact, the most meaningful classes to me. And they really provided some real living skills and some sense of context that I think I was missing from math and science and English. I think it's really critical that the movement to bring real living skills classes back to our schools is pushed forward. Because one of my greatest concerns now is that I get hundreds of young people wanting to learn agriculture. But before I can teach them anything about farming, I have to teach them how to work, how to use their hands, something you should learn when you're small and young. The other thing I want to talk about is that most of us have forgotten that until the 1980s, most food was transported by rail, which was an incredibly efficient means of providing a diverse diet regionally, not just locally. And before that, going back thousands of years, native people traded diverse foodstuffs over long distances. And this is part of my contrary nature, but a local diet is not always an inclusive diet. Local food, too often, is an experience only available to those who have the time and the money, and a much more inclusive movement would use the word regional, supported by food sheds that include a broader, more diverse bio-food production area. Now, there have been some notable and honorable efforts to rectify the gap between those who can afford good food and those who cannot, and I am coming to an end here. But too often they repeat the most common mistakes of every well-intentioned development project. You see, we cannot socially or culinarily engineer good food into the lives of other people. We cannot build bridges between classes and races and cultures solely with quiche and arugula and heirloom tomatoes. What we can do is reach out to our youth, provide programs in the schools, and most important, provide land and technical support for folks to grow for themselves. In October of 2001, I gave a speech to the Bioneers Conference in San Francisco. And I closed that speech by proposing that in memory of the thousands of people who lost their lives, that a portion of the World Trade Center be converted to an urban farm replete with greenhouses and kitchens and an education center. That this farm be established to provide food and jobs year-round to those in need, and that it become a model of a local agricultural-based economy on the grounds of what used to be a monument to the global economy. Now, my idea was put forth more as metaphor than with any expectation that it would be seriously considered. But a couple of organizations in New York City picked it up, and the proposal was officially submitted. The New York Times covered the idea, and there were hundreds of letters in support. But in the end, what was approved was, I think it was 1,492 stories of cold steel, glass, and concrete. And it was business as usual. Of course, they still haven't built that site. We could have a garden there now in that big hole that exists there. Now, had that proposal been put forth today, it would have received a much more positive reception. Awareness around food and its place in our lives and the incredibly precarious nature of the system which brings it to us has literally exploded. Language that many of us have been using for decades is now part of the public lexicon. Everyone seems to be talking the talk. But talk is cheap. And while there is an overwhelming embrace of local food and agriculture, especially amongst foodies, there is an enormous chasm between those who eat well and locally and can afford to do so, and those who cannot. There is a far greater gap between the numbers of eaters who are passionate and enthusiastic and inspired by this movement and the numbers of people whose hands are actually in the soil doing the work. So while I am thrilled that a movement that I've been so much a part of for so long is finally getting its due, I am equally concerned that so few of us are actually doing the work of farming. You know, I don't believe there is so much a food crisis or an environmental crisis as there is a crisis in awareness and a crisis in participation. We now have a couple generations of young people who are not only completely denatured, we have a couple generations who no longer know how to use their hands for anything other than pushing keys on a keyboard. But the revolution is not going to take place online or from the pages of a book or from attending a talk like this or a conference or slow food event. It will require that many more of us get involved with the real hands-in-the-soil act of growing food for ourselves and our neighbors. And I used to like to say that chefs had received almost mythical rock and roll status and that it was time for farmers to receive that same attention. But the real shift we need cannot take place when only 1% of us is doing the work to grow the food for the rest, while everyone else is cheering us on. Believe me, I love the attention, but farming is not a spectator sport. So when I go on the road, I like to tell folks to make friends with a farmer. You're going to need them. For I am certain that as the current global industrial experiment continues to unravel, agriculture will once again return to its rightful place, to the heart and the center of our society. And the leadership that's going to make this happen is not going to come from someone somewhere else. It will have to come from folks like you sitting here in this room tonight. I don't believe that the kind of structural change that will be required to turn things around will happen until it has to, until the impacts become personal. And I know this is not a particularly hopeful thought, but the hopeful piece is that humans have an incredible capacity for compassion, ingenuity, creativity, and resourcefulness, qualities that come out especially under duress and crisis. And there are certainly many examples of this historically. What will be missing when we can no longer rely on all the technology, all the dependency on someone somewhere else, all the infrastructure that brings us basic transportation and food and shelter, is the knowledge, the wisdom, the basic skills required to live on this earth. And so our job, those of us who are here today and all those around the country and the world who are re-educating ourselves, rediscovering our place in nature, is to continue to refine our skills and diligently work to create the local and regional models. For I am certain that the day will come when we will be sought after, when our farms will be the living models, the repositories that kept this sacred and essential knowledge alive. Now, if you've been very well behaved, and I did promise to show the slides, but we can also cut it off here if you would like. So it's really up to you. Okay. I'm sorry, a little more enthusiasm. Shameless. So I think it's appropriate that I close by introducing you to some folks visually and through some narrative that I met during a really extraordinary journey that I took with my eldest son, Aaron, across the U.S. and Canada, visiting individuals who had not only mastered the production of certain signature products, but who were also using their farms as platforms for social and ecological change and for education. People who were happily married to a place, if you will. Incredibly innovative folks, very passionate. And this journey culminated in a book that I did called Fields of Plenty. And what I'm going to do is show you the slides and read some of the narrative that goes with them as we go through them. And I think it's a great way to end, because I think we really do, at the end of a conversation like we had today, we need to honor the people doing the work. So this is Richard DeWild, who farms a couple hours outside of Madison, Wisconsin. Richard drives us around in his Chevy pickup to check out some of the 39 fields of vegetables that are scattered around the valley. There's a case of 30-08 Springfield Silvertip rifle cartridges sitting next to the four-wheel drive shift, a bag of tobacco and some rolling papers, and a single Cipollini onion sitting on the seat, a moving onion, it appears. Now, I don't normally get all gaga about kale, but the field we're looking at is as deep a green as anything I've ever seen. And not the kind of artificially pumped up rank green that comes from too much ammonium nitrate or urea. This one is deep and blue and forest-like. The plants are vibrant and well-formed with huge turgid leaves, each plant standing up straight, as if they've been told to pose for my cameras. Richard tells me he gets snapshots in the mail of someone's kid. I guess we will need somebody in the projection room to do. That's beautiful, thank you. Richard tells me he gets snapshots in the mail of someone's kid eating a piece of their squash or corn or a carrot. There's an enclosed note that says that this is Johnny's first meal. 18 years later, and they're providing the food for Johnny's wedding. At the market, his customers, here we go. What is it about this? We're not. Hopefully this will not be a feature of the... At the market, his customers will introduce their kids to our farmer. There's these beaming kids standing there that have been raised on his food. He tells me it makes him feel 10 feet tall. Now, I don't know how many people have that kind of job satisfaction, but there we go. Back into... how's our focus here, folks? Okay. Born in Idaho, raised in potato fields. Gene Thiel comes from 4 generations of root people. And ask any chef or farmer's market regular in Portland, Oregon, where they get their potatoes. And they'll tell you matter-of-factly, from the potato man. Now, Thiel farms at 4,600 feet in the mountains of eastern Oregon, taking advantage of a perfect convergence of ideal potato conditions, a blend of high elevation, deep glacial soils, clean and abundant fresh water, and low humidity. It's rewarding to go to restaurants and markets and find people who really appreciate what you're growing, Gene reflects. It's fundamental. We need that sustenance, that connection, that completion. When you produce a product and they see its value, it's like searing truth. They taste that truth. It's the ultimate compliment. Everything at Stratford Dairy in Vermont is run on gravity. The milk moves downhill from the milking barn to the cooling tanks, then on to the bottling and ice cream rooms without the use of a single pump. And when the pastures were cleared, trees were left strategically, so that as the shade moved across the pasture, so would the cows. Now, at first, I marveled at these simple innovations. And then I realized it doesn't exactly require a master's degree in industrial design to figure out that using gravity is a good idea, or that trees provide shade and cows will follow. It's just that so much of agriculture has lost any relationship to common sense. We've got this idea that things need to be complicated to be any good, that simple solutions can't possibly be as good as technological ones. And Earl Ransom runs the 30-cow Guernsey dairy herd, selling milk in glass bottles just like the milkman used to drop off in front of my house when I was growing up. The farm also produces premium ice cream made with the eggs from older brother Barry. Of all the things I'd like to give my boys, I want them to be able to die as old men on this land, Earl's wife Amy tells me. I also want them to be respectful, she says. I want to make pickles, and I want to personally eliminate all the flies from this farm with my swatter. Simple needs. Jennifer Green farms alone, producing 30 different grains with a team of horses. She does her own milling and produces pancake mixes and polentas and breakfast cereals, which she provides to the 200 families in San Francisco who are members in her grain share program. You know, we often agonize over the quality of our vegetables or fruit, wax eloquently over cheese or wine, but accept flowers, edible seeds, and cereals that are rarely fresh and come from a limited diversity of plants. Okay, who can tell me what this is? There's a reward. Sorry. Who said millet? I said millet. Oh, man, I can't give away 3 rewards. I think Molly said it first. That's what I heard. So see me afterwards. And it's not just a hug, I'll tell you that. But that'll be part of it. Okay. Jennifer's 30-acre canvas. By the way, you know what the thing is that publishers have absolutely no sense of humor, because that's the lead image for the chapter called Militants, right? And I suggested, well, why don't we just misspell the word M-I-L-L-E-T-A-N-C-E? But, you know, they weren't going for it. So that's why they're all going out of business, by the way, you know. Jennifer's 30-acre canvas is filled with 1/3 to 1/2 acre plots of amaranth, barley, millet, teff, heirloom wheats, blue and yellow popcorns, garbanzos, lentils, and fava beans, all merging and mingling together. In the spring, before our visit, the pear and apple trees on Bob and Eileen and Selena Lane's place were loaded with fruit. And special attention was paid to the orchard, to pest and disease control, to summer pruning, and to the very time-consuming, expensive job of fruit thinning. By late July, the Lanes were preparing for the largest crop they had ever had, and doing as most of us would, quietly planning on what they would do with the much-needed extra income. Tuesday, July 26, was clear and sunny and hot. Work had wrapped up early, and the small crew was hanging out talking near the house. There was a distant rumbling, and a mellow thunderstorm began. Then the sky turned black, the temperature plummeted 30 degrees, and lightning came down in sheets. At 3:15, the hail came, large hail up to a 1/2 inch in diameter. Exactly 13 minutes later, the hail stopped, the sky cleared, the sun came out, and the Lane's fruit crop was destroyed. So not everyone's story was so wonderful that summer. Eli Zabar is not a farmer. He is a successful baker and retailer with several stores in Manhattan that feature products from his own kitchens, bakeries, and now from over 1/2 acre of his own rooftop gardens. Now, these gardens aren't just some passing novelty trial experience. Zabar invested in installing steel beam reinforcements for the rooftops above his bakeries, where pipes carry the spent heat from the ovens into the greenhouses. Winter tomatoes and salad greens are produced by 2 full-time rooftop farmers. Ask anyone in northern Wisconsin what to grow, and they'll likely tell you milk cows or corn. No one would ever suggest sheep. And if they did, it certainly would not be for milk or for cheese. So when Mary and David Falk launched their sheep dairy operation, their neighbors thought they had lost their minds. Now, this ain't no high-tech, heavily capitalized dairy operation. From the Orv's pizza truck turned cooler to the homemade milking platform, everything has been patched and pieced and thrown together. The cheese is truly adventurous. Wrapped in vodka-soaked nettles, aged on cedar boughs, if you've been raised in white bread America eating individually wrapped sliced Swiss and orange cheddar singles, you'll probably think twice if you saw the Fox cheese. Brown and crusty with ruts and holes, blue and white with brown streaks covered in leaves, they look like some bad experiment gone awry. Mary's own mother told her they look like moldy horse turds. But their customers seek out their classic homely and ugly look, and the cheeses have won numerous national awards, and that was some of the best cheese I have ever eaten, let me tell you. Farmer John Thurman chuckles as he tells me, "We're sure not keeping up with the Joneses," nodding towards the 3 rusting 20-foot trailers that house he and his wife Ida and their 7 children. And at night we gather outside to talk. I take out one of my harmonicas to entertain the kids and begin to blow a slow blues in the key of G. I actually forgot it, or I'd do it for you tonight. Ida rolls her eyes with pleasure. When I play the final note, she tells me it reminds her of her roots in Mississippi and the old-timers used to sit around telling stories and playing music. Considering the poverty that exists here, I am amazed to discover how much of John and Ida's time and energy goes into community projects, teaching local youth how to grow food, providing fresh vegetables to seniors, organizing a black farmers cooperative. And John describes the farm as, quote, "nothing special, just a group of hardworking people trying to make something beautiful." And each week, John and Ida and their kids trek into Chicago to sell collards and sweet potatoes and beans and melons and pasture-raised chicken to the all-black Austin Farmers Market in a neighborhood that does not have a single grocery store. And Ken Dunn farms in the city of Chicago in the shadow of Cabrini Green, the 16-story prison-styled wired-covered housing project built in the 50s to warehouse the city's poor and unemployed. And Dunn's 2 one-acre plots boast 30 varieties of heirloom tomatoes, striped German, Brandywine, green zebra, black Russian, growing in the composted remains of rejected apple and cherry pie filling, and the uneaten arugula salads and filet mignons from local high-end restaurants. 5 tons of compost made from Chicago's waste has been laid down over this site, just a fraction of the 15,000 tons of urban waste that is disposed of in the city each and every day. The ground feels like a sponge. And if I closed my eyes and plugged my ears, it would feel as if I was walking on the floor of some virgin forest. The tomatoes don't seem to mind the constant noise or bad air or the poverty that surrounds their little island. The plants are tall and robust and absolutely loaded. Their world is rich in nutrients, reflected warmth and light from pavement and buildings. And the attention is given to them by local chefs who are thrilled to tell their clientele that the tomatoes on the menu were harvested down the street. Hilario Alvarez slipped over the border into the U.S. 20 years ago to work in America's fields. He had nothing. Now he owns his own farm and employs over 100 people. And Alvarez's pepper field is like some out-of-control block party. 85 varieties, many of his own selections, are thrown together in an 8-acre burlesque of color and shape. There is humor in this field, a former migrant's statement on the ultralinear, monocultural, totally predictable fields of America's industrial agriculture. I tell Hilario he is crazy, that I've never seen anything like this before, that he should quit harvesting peppers and open the field up as a seasonal museum. I imagine docents giving tours, stopping along the rows to discuss the history and culture and use of certain varieties, the arrangement of color and shape, what the farmer was going through in his life when he planted this section or that, as if they are standing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, analyzing a Matisse or a Van Gogh. And finally, my friends George and Anna Zebroff, Russian Doukhobor fruit farmers in British Columbia. As we are preparing to leave, George pulls me aside. You have eaten our apricots fresh and dried. You drank our apricot nectar and even tried the kernels. But there is one thing left. There's a slightly mischievous tone in his voice as he guides me to the front of the house. There on the stump of a cherry tree, now used as a table, is a bucket of fresh warm goat's milk, a small container of amber honey, a few spoons and glasses, and a tall glass bottle filled with a clear liquid. This, he tells me, is apricot elixir. There is ritual to all this. In Russian, he asks his young grandson to demonstrate. With a spoonful of honey in one hand and a glass of warm milk in the other, the young boy alternates back and forth. Then comes the elixir. George mixes it with goat's milk and we toast. It is a powerful drink, but it goes down easy. He pours another and we drink again. I protest when he offers me a shot without the milk. He insists and we drink again. It is hot. We have a long drive, and I haven't had much to eat. Grapevines and cherry and apricot and apple trees swirl beneath us in a carpet of green. Children roll and giggle in a nearby hammock. Freshly dug potatoes and greens and meats are being prepared for Sunday dinner. And I am back as a child with my Russian-born grandparents, sitting at their table, drinking and eating and sharing. Thank you very much.